The air in Berlin was thick with smoke and the distant echoes of artillery fire. Deep within the Führerbunker, Adolf Hitler sat in silence, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the wooden desk before him. The once mighty leader of Germany was now a shadow of his former self. His hair had grayed prematurely, his hands trembled slightly, and his piercing gaze held a vacancy that had not been there before. Memories surged through his mind, visions of the past, of how it had all begun. He recalled the grand halls of Munich, the fiery speeches that had captivated thousands, the way his words had woven through the minds of the people like a spell. He had promised them power, prosperity, and the restoration of a Germany that had been stripped of its pride. And they had believed him. The National Socialist movement had grown, first in whispers and then in roars, until the entire nation had marched beneath his banner. In the early years, victory had seemed inevitable. Poland had fallen in mere weeks, France had been reduced to submission, and even the mighty Britain had trembled under the weight of his air raids. His army, his machine of war, had surged across Europe, breaking resistance with brutal efficiency. His generals had praised his instincts, calling him a mastermind, a leader unlike any before. The world had watched in awe as Germany, once crippled by the Treaty of Versailles, rose to become an empire feared by all. But power came at a cost. The more he conquered, the more enemies he made. And enemies learned. The war had expanded beyond his control, stretching his forces too thin. Britain refused to yield. The Soviet Union proved an unbreakable beast, and America entered the war with its endless supply of resources and manpower. Hitler had envisioned a swift victory, but instead, he found himself in a war of attrition, one he could not afford. Doubt crept in, first from the whispers of advisors, then from the very men he had trusted most. His generals hesitated, questioned his decisions. The fire in their eyes, once filled with blind loyalty, had dimmed. Even Joseph Goebbels, his most devoted propagandist, struggled to maintain the illusion of victory. Reports from the front lines were no longer triumphant. Losses in Africa, a failed siege of Moscow, and resistance in occupied territories all signaled a war slipping from his grasp. Yet Hitler refused to see it. He convinced himself that this was temporary, that one decisive strike would turn the tide. He trusted no one, dismissing officers who dared suggest retreat, replacing them with younger men too fearful to challenge him. He ordered cities to stand firm, no surrender, no retreat, even as his armies were cut off and annihilated. Now, in the bunker beneath the ruined capital, he clung to those early memories of glory. He ignored the distant echoes of defeat, the crumbling walls above him. He was still the man who had risen from nothing. He was still the leader of Germany, and he would not accept failure. The tide had turned, and Hitler knew it. He had seen the reports, the maps marked with advancing enemy lines, the cities lost one by one. But he refused to acknowledge what everyone around him already understood. Germany was collapsing. He lashed out at his generals, blaming them for incompetence, accusing them of cowardice. They stood before him, silent, knowing that arguing was pointless. Orders were given, impossible demands were made, and his rage grew with every failure. Stalingrad had been the first true blow. He had promised victory, assured his troops that the city would fall. But the Soviets had held their ground, grinding down his Sixth Army until there was nothing left. When news of the surrender reached him, his fury was uncontainable. He branded Friedrich Paulus, his once trusted commander, a traitor. There would be no more surrenders, he decreed. Germany would fight to the last man, the last bullet. Then came the Normandy invasion. The Allies had stormed the beaches, overwhelming the Atlantic Wall he had trusted so much. Reports of American and British forces pushing inland sent waves of panic through his high command, but Hitler dismissed them. He insisted that it was a diversion, that the real attack would come elsewhere. By the time he finally accepted the truth, it was too late. France was slipping away, and with it, the Western Front. Within his inner circle, loyalty was breaking. The men who had once followed him, without question, now whispered in the shadows. Some, like Heinrich Himmler, secretly reached out to the Allies, hoping to save themselves. Others, like Erwin Rommel, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, saw the war for what it was, lost. But the greatest betrayal came from within his own ranks. The July 20th plot, a plan to assassinate him, had come closer than any before. A brief moment of chaos, an explosion in his war room, and he had survived. He emerged, bloodied but alive, and in his mind, more justified than ever. Revenge followed. Hundreds were arrested, tortured, executed. Rommel, though beloved by the people, was forced to take poison. Generals were hanged with piano wire, their deaths filmed as a warning. Hitler was convinced this purge would restore loyalty, but in reality, it only deepened the fear. Those who remained in his presence nodded, agreed, swore their allegiance, but inside, they had already given up. The Soviets were pushing from the east, the Allies from the west. The Reich was shrinking by the day. His speeches, once thunderous declarations of destiny, had turned into ramblings of a man disconnected from reality. He spoke of secret weapons, last-minute victories, divisions that no longer existed. His officers listened, stone-faced, knowing the end was near. In the bunker, he paced, hands shaking, eyes hollow. He spoke to maps, to ghosts of past victories. He ordered counterattacks that would never come. Outside, the world moved forward, but inside those concrete walls, time stood still. The Führer of Germany was no longer leading an empire. He was simply waiting for it all to collapse around him. The walls of the bunker seemed to close in tighter each day. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of sweat, smoke, and the lingering bitterness of defeat. Hitler's world had shrunk to a series of dimly lit rooms, each filled with anxious faces that no longer believed in his words. Outside, the city burned. The once mighty capital of the Reich was now a wasteland of rubble and despair, with Soviet troops tightening their grip around what little remained. Hitler refused to leave. Escape had been suggested, flights out of Berlin, a retreat to the Alps, even surrender, but he dismissed them all with disgust. He would not abandon the city. If Berlin fell, he would fall with it. His determination was no longer rooted in strategy, but in pure, unrelenting delusion. He still spoke of miracles, of armies that no longer existed, of counterattacks that would never come. His generals no longer argued. They simply listened, nodded, and prepared for their own fates. Eva Braun had joined him, her devotion unwavering even as everything collapsed around them. She had lived for years in the shadows of his power, a figure few had ever acknowledged publicly. Now, in these final days, she had chosen to stay at his side. She moved through the bunker with a quiet acceptance, as if she had already made peace with what was to come. She spoke of normal things, as if trying to hold on to some sense of life amid the madness, of music, of past summers, of memories that no longer belonged to this world. As Soviet shells struck closer, Hitler's paranoia deepened. He no longer trusted anyone. He ranted about betrayal, accusing his closest officers of cowardice. He dismissed reports of defeat as lies, then turned violent when reality could no longer be ignored. Those who had once feared his wrath now pitted him. He was a man reduced to shouting at maps, ordering divisions that had long been annihilated. Even Goebbels, his most loyal follower, seemed resigned to the inevitable. In a final act of defiance, Hitler dictated his will. He spoke not of regrets, not of the destruction he had caused, but of betrayal. He blamed his generals, his allies, the German people themselves for failing him. He made it clear he would not allow himself to be captured. He would not be paraded through Moscow, humiliated before the world. The decision had already been made. The bunker was silent that evening. Outside, the Red Army was within blocks. The last defenders of Berlin were outnumbered, outgunned, but still fighting because surrender meant death. Inside, Hitler sat motionless, staring at nothing. His hands no longer shook. His voice, once filled with fury, was now quiet, almost calm. The end was near, and for the first time he truly understood it. The bunker was eerily quiet. The muffled explosions outside no longer seemed to matter. Hitler sat in his dimly lit room, staring at the walls, lost in thought. The empire he had built, the war he had unleashed, the victories he had once celebrated. All of it was gone. There was no future, no escape, no redemption. The Reich was finished. Eva Braun sat beside him, her presence the only familiar comfort left. She had accepted her fate without hesitation, knowing that there was no life for her beyond this place. They had been married only hours earlier, a final act of defiance against a world that had turned against them. There had been no celebration, no joy, just a silent acknowledgement that the end had come. His most trusted staff gathered in the main hall, their faces hollow, their loyalty now driven by routine rather than belief. Hitler emerged, his expression unreadable. He said little, only brief instructions for what was to be done after. His body was not to be taken by the Soviets. There would be no surrender, no trial, no humiliation. Those who remained nodded, already knowing what was coming. Some had made their own plans: cyanide pills, a pistol, a last drink before it all ended. Returning to his room, Hitler retrieved the pistol he had carried for years. Eva, calm and composed, took the cyanide capsule he had given her. There were no dramatic speeches, no final words of regret. There was nothing left to say. Moments later, it was over. The most feared man in the world was gone, his body slumped in the chair, his reign reduced to silence. His staff acted quickly. As ordered, they carried his body outside, doused it in fuel, and set it ablaze. The flames consumed him, the last remnants of his existence turning to ash amid the ruins of Berlin. The smell of burning flesh mixed with the smoke of the city, where battles still raged in the streets. The Soviet forces were closing in, unaware that the man they sought was already gone. One by one, those left behind made their own decisions. Some tried to escape, others took their lives in the same bunker that had once been the center of Nazi power. The walls that had echoed with Hitler's voice for years now heard only whispers and gunshots. By the time Soviet troops reached the bunker, there was little left. The bodies they found were nameless, the man responsible for the war nowhere to be seen. Rumors spread, theories formed, but the truth remained buried in the ashes. The Reich was no more. The world had changed forever. Outside, the ruins of Berlin stood as a testament to what had been lost. Streets once filled with marching soldiers now lay in rubble. Silence replaced the chants of loyalty. A new era had begun, but the scars of the past would never fully fade. Hitler was gone, but the consequences of his rule would linger far beyond the flames that had consumed him.